Dear SQL DBA, we are going to start log shipping to reduce our time to recover from an outage. What can I do proactively to make things easier on myself when I want to switch over to the disaster recovery site, especially if the original system is unavailable? I'm particularly worried about syncing user accounts and dealing with SQL agent jobs. How can I be better prepared for disaster? From Mystified in Montana. Welcome to the Dear SQL DBA podcast and YouTube show. I'm Kendra Little, and I answer questions from database administrators and sometimes from the people who work with them. This week's question is about failure, and I love this topic. When we work as DBAs, our job is to make failure go as well as it can, right? We try to prevent failures whenever possible, but a big part of the job of the database administrator is to say, okay, we've got failure. How can we have the best failure possible? One of my very favorite quotes, and I loved this even before I was a DBA, is from Samuel Beckett, who said, "Ever tried, ever better, no matter. Try again, fail better." And to me, that always actually spoke to me just about life. Don't be so concerned about failure and about getting things perfect. We are going to fail again. We need to fail better. It's another way of just saying, things will never be perfect. And we just got to anticipate that and, handle it the best we can. And Mystified in Montana, you are totally right. Just simply setting up log shipping or mirroring or clustering or even an availability group, just setting that up isn't enough. You need to think about, what am I actually going to do when this happens, and what do I need to handle, and what's going to go wrong? So there are really, I think, two major types of failovers that you have to think about. And you've got to think about planned failover, when you can get to the original production system, at least for a short amount of time. And then Mystified in Montana is really even more concerned about the second type of unplanned failover, saying, okay, well, what if I can't even get to my normal production site to check it and see, hey, do I have things right on my secondary disaster recovery site? Some people have multiple sites to think about, not just one disaster recovery site. Mystified in Montana is asking about, hey, I'm just starting out with one secondary site for disaster purposes. So we're really talking about starting at that point today. The more sites you've got, the more complicated this gets. Now, the truth is, though, I agree that unplanned failovers are harder, but even planned failovers are actually pretty hard, because even if we are doing a planned failover, usually we have pretty limited time. The reasons that I've known folks to do planned failovers are things are going really badly in the production site for whatever reason, and I've seen it happen because of weather. We know a storm is coming. We anticipate that the data center is going to have an outage, but we know before it goes completely out. Maybe it's already on a backup generator or something like that. So I've known some cases where, and you're like, okay, well, we got to get out fast, but we can still get in. But usually the situation of a planned failover, usually you want to make sure that you're really set up and ready to go and can execute everything quickly. In other words, you don't have a lot of time to do manual stuff. So even in a planned failover, you really got to have a checklist and be ready to execute and pretty comfortable knowing exactly what to do. So even that's still pretty tricky. The very first thing, and the thing that will be most key to your success in failing well, is to set up a really safe test environment for your whole system. And you need it to have half in production and half in the DR site, and to be set up with the same basic security and network configuration that you have in production. So in other words, if you have a different production domain than you have domain in the disaster recovery site, you need that same setup and the same trust between them. You don't have to use the exact production domain, and in fact, I would recommend that you don't. I would recommend having a production test domain with a similar setup to the production domain. You really just want it to be simulated. You do want a safe sandbox, and the more it can be not in production, but in a safe testing area that's just very much like production, the better off you are. If production is physical servers and your test environment is virtual servers, particularly for log shipping, that's not that big a deal because you don't have to configure it differently. If you're doing something like failover clustering, you probably want it to be as similar as possible, but get it to be as close as it can. Try to make sure that, all the permissions and firewall rules are similar. Now, one of the biggest risks is as soon as we have multiple environments and making them similar, there's of course the risk that we could think that we're working in production and we could think that we're working in production test and oops, we're working in production. We got it backwards, like I just did in that previous sentence, right? This is always a risk. So what I like to do is when you're registering your SQL servers in Management Studio, there's a way that you can actually register the server and kind of color code them. So I always color code production red and, safer environments green. There's add-ins you can get. Some are pay where you can use regular expressions to color code in Management Studio too. And then for remote desktop access, free tool from Microsoft, I believe the sysinternals group put this out. I mean, it's old. BG Info. Really great. You can have it change the color of the desktops of your server. So when you connect to them with remote desktop, you can have different colors for different types of servers. So I thought I was connecting to prod test, but this desktop is orange. So I've clearly, accidentally connected to production. So you want to have that environment set up, restore the databases to it, and get your log shipping set up in that test environment because you want to simulate all of the failures that you're going to hit in production in this test environment first and execute both planned failovers and unplanned failovers in the test environment to build up your checklists. Having this prod test demo environment is super critical to your success. It is your biggest, greatest tool to learn about this stuff. So it's the really priority one. Once you get in there and you set up the log shipping in the production test environment and you start executing your failovers, there's a big decision to make. And you have to figure out for you and your team, what is the balance you want between process and automation? Because you can build a lot of stuff just into a checklist and manage a lot of stuff by process. And if you have one or two production SQL servers, not a ton to take care of, you might prefer a more process-driven approach because it is more customizable. So for example, as changes come forward to your SQL server, before, you get the environments in sync with the logins and the SQL Server agent jobs when you first set it up. And then let's say we have a code release and we're going to add in, the database gets a couple stored procedures. Now, the database change will just flow through log shipping. That's no big deal. But like Mystified in Montana says, hey, what if there's a change to a SQL agent job or a new login? Well, in a process-based thing, your new change deployment process would say, hey, if you have any changes outside the database, go manually make them at the disaster recovery site as well. Now, that is actually pretty convenient because you probably should, you should, and you probably do, you absolutely should, have different security setups between your production and your disaster recovery environments. You shouldn't be using the same accounts across all of these environments. You don't want it so that if a hacker gets access to one of the environments, they immediately have the whole world. You want the principle of least permissions. So that means if we're creating a login in production, we shouldn't just script the same thing to be created because it should be an account that needs to be created in Active Directory in the disaster site, right? And it's actually got a different identity. Now that's not that easy to automate the scripting. It's more manual, and it does make sense to have that as part of a manual process, right? Similarly, if we are changing a SQL agent job, does it do anything that accesses other SQL servers using a linked server? Because, hey, that's going to have a different name in the DR environment, right? The related server. So there are benefits to having a manual process in that these things that aren't and shouldn't be identical in the two environments, you just handle them as you're doing it. You do want to do an auditing processing about every 6 weeks, at minimum once a quarter, to make sure that things are similar in both environments and they haven't gotten out of sync. But this can actually, this approach can be really hard if you have a lot of SQL servers to manage. And in some cases, you might have an environment where you can't really control the groups of people who deploy changes to these SQL servers, because maybe some of the SQL servers are internal use and you've got business users who can change jobs. That's not appropriate for every environment, but it certainly happens. Maybe you've got a DevOps situation and the people deploying the changes come from different teams and don't all follow the exact change process. In those situations, and even if you just as the DBA, maybe you're managing, 500 SQL servers and you can't manually do this DR step for each one. In those situations, you do have to put a bunch of work into automation, and you can create rules to handle things like different domains. You may have to help work with other teams to help manage the Active Directory part of the change, but you can basically say, okay, well, we're going to have nightly scripts that check and look for new SQL Server agent jobs that we don't know about yet, and either copy them to the DR environment. I would leave them disabled, right? Because what if they do things that aren't safe to run in there because they reference back to production? You need to make sure that you can't accidentally run things in DR that mess up production. But maybe script them out and push them to a file share and notify you, or create them disabled, whatever is safe in your environment. Similarly, look for changes in logins and either script them and notify you, or do whatever is appropriate. Look for new linked servers and stage changes, and basically have scripts that are checking for things and helping you, because at a certain scale, you just can't do it all manually, and with certain processes, you can't do it all manually too. So that can be really helpful, and PowerShell is really a good friend if you do need to go that automation route in terms of, hey, we really need to be exporting things and looking at changes. If you are looking for tools for automating this kind of thing, there is an example. You don't have to start from scratch. People have created wonderful tools out there, and I add a big disclaimer. I am not a big PowerShell person. I have, years ago, I fiddled with it. I basically know enough PowerShell to be super duper dangerous, not in a good way. But other people are much smarter at PowerShell than me. And one really cool example of something you could look at in your test site is dbatools.io. So dbatools.io. I did not write this stuff. Like I said, derp, derp, derp. But in terms of having functionality for scripting out or copying logins, a lot of the tools on dbatools.io were designed for things like migrations. And you don't want to do a migration to your DR site, but things, like scripting out logins and link servers and permissions can be really, really easier to automate building on someone else's functionality. So check it out if you are going that PowerShell route, dbatools.io. One of the things that I did check on their documentation, by the way, which I think is really cool, is when it is exporting logins, is it smart about scripting them out? So Mystified in Montana is rightfully a little concerned about logins. Microsoft has a script that they recommend to transfer logins, because actually scripting out logins can be tricky. It is KB 918992, and I'll include a link in the show notes on littlekendra.com. You can always go to littlekendra.com/dear SQL DBA. for links to show notes and all sorts of stuff on how to subscribe. Microsoft has this KB on if you are scripting it out manually. Hey, use this code from us so that you script out the logins properly so that things work right after you fail over. The DBAtools.io, the way that they script out the login is, I believe, again, not a super PowerShell expert, I believe it's consistent with what Microsoft recommends in that it scripts out the SIDs for Windows logins. Right, so it can be a little tricky and you want to make sure to either follow that KB or really test and make sure, not just have I created the login, but does the login actually work after I fail over? And on that note, you need to practice planned and unplanned failovers. So you've got your test environment, you figured out here's how, I'm going to handle when changes of these types are made and you've tested it in your test environment. You need to start actually practicing failovers. So for planned failovers, make sure that you got documented how to execute it. For log shipping specifically, for Mystified in Montana, it's important to know how to actually fail over log shipping properly. And the way that you should do it is you should take a final log backup manually. Disable all the log shipping jobs. Make sure all the backups are done, they've been copied over and restored with the log shipping stuff. And then take your final log shipping backup with the no recovery keyword. This is magical when you can do it for a planned failover because when you take a log backup with no recovery, it says, hey, no more changes in this database. And it makes sure that you backed up the last things that got written to the database. In other words, it is a way that you can be like, hey, I know we didn't lose any data on this planned failover because when I took this last log backup, it said no more writes. Like, that's golden, right? Then you copy and you restore that last backup over to your disaster recovery site. And if you actually do this way, you can reverse the log shipping so that you don't have to reset it up in the opposite direction, including the full backup again. You can actually now say, okay, well, the disaster recovery site is now the primary, and we'll go reverse the other way. This is really worth knowing how to do, especially because then you're like, no. We know we didn't lose any data because we took that last backup. You also need to create your checklist and say, not only here's how to do the planned failover, but after we actually do it and bring it up, here's the jobs to turn on so that we are taking backups in the disaster recovery site. Here's the jobs to turn on to do maintenance, because those jobs won't succeed if the database is offline unless you've got a special check in the job that says, okay, we're going to run all the time and check the status of the database. So depending on how you have your maintenance set up in the DR site, you may have to flip some things on if you haven't made them so they can just run all the time. Even if they do run all the time, you want to have a checklist step to verify that they work. I say that speaking from experience because jobs get turned off in the DR site all the time and people forget to turn them back on. People like me. I'll just go ahead and say that, right? So in your failover checklist, you've got to have steps. Even if the job should just automatically work, you need to have a verification step of, hey, look at them and make sure it's really happening. Because someone like me may have disabled the job when a change was happening and forgotten to re-enable them. Maybe more than once, right? Also, after failover, when you're first testing failover, you need to make sure that the logins actually work, even if you were very careful to script them out. Just like Microsoft said, you need to make sure that you don't have what's called orphan users. There is a built-in procedure, SP change users login, that you can use to fix this. I always have as a step in my checklist a link, the exact script I want and the link to the Microsoft KB on checking databases for orphaned users. Also, for databases you have that have trustworthy set to on, that will not automatically be on when you first fail over that database. Trustworthy, that property, I know it sounds like you're like, oh, I am trustworthy. Well, you have to restore the database fully and then change trustworthy to on because it really wants to make sure that you do trust the trustworthy property on that particular server instance. If you're using something like the CLR that is dependent upon that trustworthy property, and you don't turn it on, then things could go badly. So those are the things that you often have to look at. There's going to be business specific stuff that you find where it's like, oh, we forgot that someone set up replication, heaven help us. Or, oh, there's a link server that no one thought was used, and it turns out it's used and it wasn't created over there. So you really do have to practice failing over and then get as many application processes running against the database from the app tier as possible to discover what's going to go wrong and to really build your checklist well. So yeah, it does get even harder with unplanned failovers. So this is why we start with the planned, right? For unplanned failovers, practicing them in your test environment isn't that hard. You just turn off your log shipping publisher and make sure you can't get to it. So don't practice your failover with that thing turned on. You really want to simulate, I can't get in there at all. And one of the biggest questions you're going to be asked in an unplanned failover situation is, how much data have we lost? So in your checklist, you need to document what is the process we use for estimating how much data we lost. And in the case of log shipping, you're looking at, when did that system go down? And what is the last log backup we got out of it for each database? And then what is the frequency of the log backups? How much do we think could have happened after we got the last one copied out, but before it went down? So you need to have documented some information about your log shipping to figure that out appropriately. You do need to also estimate, okay, well, and practice, what's going to happen if we have this scenario where we have the unplanned failover, and then 3 hours later or 3 days later, heaven help us, the primary site comes back online. And we figure out, that in fact there was maybe 5 minutes of data that, there's log backups that kept happening. The server was still going before the site went down. And we didn't get all the data on the log shipping database that we brought up. So how are we going to figure out what data is in the primary site and not in the secondary site, and what are we going to do about it? Depending on how your schema is in different databases and depending on how critical the data is, in some situations, your management is going to want you to keep those databases, the original ones, online and around so that the team can investigate critical data and figure out, okay, how are we going to compare and figure out what data discrepancies we have and then correct it. So you're going to need space to keep those databases online. But if the data is really critical, hey, you're going to want to get back to production as soon as possible too. And you're not going to want to run exposed in the DR site without log shipping back to another place. So you have to think about, okay, if I am in this situation where I have to have the primary site databases online and the secondary, we're in disaster site, how much do I need extra space in production so I can prepare to fail back? What are we going to do in this situation? And you need to make a plan, because the answer might be, well, okay, we'll back up the old production databases and restore them elsewhere, but where is elsewhere? So you may need to ask for more resources for either site after you kind of figure out, okay, if we have to do this unplanned failover, what will we do in the aftermath? You may need to ask for, hey, can we have some storage so that if we need to have a duplicate copy of production to figure out something like data discrepancies after an unplanned failover, what kind of storage can we have for it and where can we allocate it? Because getting that into the budget before the disaster is much better than trying to scramble and find it during the disaster. It is pretty normal to figure out that you need more resources when you're actually practicing a DR situation, right? Now, finally, the most advanced step and the most important, if failing over is important, is to practice planned failovers in the production environment. Now, this is not just up to you, but companies that are serious about planning for failover regularly fail over in production. They usually aren't so excited about losing data on purpose. So they do planned failovers in production, and they do it on a regular basis. The more often you actually fail over, the better you will get at it, because you're going to find, especially in the early days, you're going to find all of this stuff where, we hadn't accounted for that scheduled task on the server that no one knew about. Or, because it's been there for a long time, or for some reason it got deployed. You can't do this by yourself. It's about a lot more than the databases. It's about application tier servers. It's about the whole environment. But it's an incredibly important thing for you to support, because if you can do this in production, it is really good for you in terms of making sure that your processes all work and getting it just airtight and getting really good at it. It is the best way for you to avoid nasty surprises, is to work through it with the whole environment. So bring this up to your management after you've worked through it and talk about, here's all of the practice failovers I've done in our prod test environments. I've learned all of this stuff. I know that we have some more issues to work through. Is there a time period when we can, as, a whole IT group and possibly a whole, company, including developers, if you have those as well, that we can actually test our failovers for our active systems in a planned way? And the first time you do this, it may be just an outage for your customers, right? You may not want to have active customers in the system the first time you fail over to your DR site. In fact, usually you wouldn't. You may just have a tester or two kind of making sure to kick things around. Even if the answer is no at first, that's fine. That's great. The thing you want to do is just keep bringing it up in a supportive way and say, hey, is it possible when you're having something like an annual review? When annual reviews for you are also great times for you to talk about the goals for things you'd like to approach in the next 6 months to the next year. To say, hey, does it look like it's an option on the horizon to work in failing over to the disaster recovery environment for our IT shop, in the next 6 months or the next year? Does it, what are people feeling about that? The more you bring it up, the better it's going to be for you. And you're really helping, by suggesting it, you're helping drive this for your whole group in the direction it should be going. That is, in the long term, the best for your business. So recap what we have talked about how to fail better. The biggest, most important way to get started is to set up your safe prod test environment with similar setup to production, where you can practice your planned failovers and your unplanned failovers, and where you can test out the tools that you want to use for process and automation, and where you can build tools that help you say, okay, if we make this change, I want to automatically script it out and then notify this team of it. You want to execute your planned failovers and your unplanned failovers in that test environment and build your checklist for what happens when disaster strikes. And you want to get active prod test applications on that disaster recovery site so you can really make sure, hey, does the app work after failover, or are there things like orphan users that we have to take care of over there? You want to drive towards getting to a place where you can practice planned failover in production, do it live, and make sure that your company, your entire team, as well as you, are ready to navigate things when things fail, as unfortunately things always can. This has been an episode of Dear SQL DBA, produced by me, Kendra Little. Music this episode was provided by Scott Holmes. I'll see you again next week for another episode.